Hi everyone. So today we're going to talk about the open source program offices, and we've got a great panel to start that discussion. So just to introduce myself quickly, my name is Matt Wilson. I'm a director of product here at Docker. We've got Felix, who runs the open source program office at TomTom. Anna, who's a open source product office program manager at TODO. Manrique, who works at Intertext, and Guy, who's the director of open source and standards at NVIDIA. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming today. So let's kick off. So first question to you all, and to start off, can each of you describe why your company has either an open source program office and what value it gets from it, or why you're working in open source?
So, yeah, maybe I can start. As you said, I work at TomTom, and to be honest, we are very early in our OSPO journey. Of course, not using open source software and contributing into it, but setting up an OSPO is relatively new to us. I think it's interesting. You know, we're a Mac maker, and we also provide geolocation technology to car makers, right? So that means lots of standards, regulations, and we have to provide very long-term software and service support. So a lot of stuff we do is, of course, based on open source software. So you can imagine in this mix that there's a lot of benefit and value to have a bit more structure around managing open source software in your company. So obviously starting using open source software, but also how do you contribute? And if you have some kind of way to help your employees and engineers to understand how to do that, I think there's tremendous value and many dimensions on open source. So from the usage part, contribution side, of course, and also giving back to these communities you rely upon. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Guy, do you have a...
Yeah, well, I come from, I guess, a long line of open source program office endeavors. Most recently at Autodesk for a couple of years, and prior to that, Samsung and Red Hat. You know, at NVIDIA right now, we're kind of in a very similar journey, actually, to what Felix described in terms of just kind of getting off the ground as to what we're doing with regard to OSPO. Most of my work right now is in our Omniverse product team, which is where I'm kind of sitting in helping them understand open source and open standards more effectively. And, you know, I think it's kind of interesting because I know we're going to dive a little bit more into this panel later of kind of the discussions you have to actually get an OSPO created, and kind of the interesting journey you go through in terms of getting everybody on the same page. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. Anna.
Yeah, so well, I'm gonna give a different angle because I'm not running an OSPO, but I'm a program manager of an open group of OSPO practitioners. So organizations from all different size, shapes, and different regions that gathers together to create resources on how to build an OSPO, also try to help on OSPO education. We have a lot of seasoned OSPOers that were there and say, why don't we just share what our learnings and share it to the public in a transparent way? And all these resources are open, are available. And from this angle, I've been very honored and had the opportunity to learn a lot of how other companies, depending on their different culture, on the different needs, because I think everyone agrees that there's not a template to build an OSPO. Like, it depends on the organization, on the sector, and so on. So I'm really happy to be part of that and learn like how other organizations, depending on the different specific challenges, they're building their OSPO and the value of the OSPO they are taking from that.
Cool, thank you. And just lastly, Manrique.
Yeah, well, actually, similar to Guy, I have a lot of experience on open source for more than 20 years, but I have recently joined Inditex, I think 1 year ago, to set up an OSPO. So the idea is, okay, let's start building this thing. Probably our case is one of these different angles that Anna has mentioned, that, okay, our business, our core business is not producing software, it's not using technology to sell to others, but technology is one of the main assets we use and we build to provide services. We are a retail company. So you know, Sarah, Pull & Beer, and all these brands are behind the same umbrella. And okay, we are not selling technology, but we are using a lot of open source. We are contributing back to open source, and we have done that with not a formal way. And since sustainability is one of our own values, our main values now in the business, is why not applying sustainability to the code part we are doing. So, okay, we are contributing back. Let's do it as a brand, as a company, as a responsibility we have with the communities and the projects we are using. So the main view we have for an OSPO is, okay, we are managing relationship of the company with the ecosystem that surrounds the company, the open source ecosystem, because at the end of the day, any technology nowadays is using open source. Every technology is using open source at some point. So why not contributing back? So that is a starting point. So let's see how it goes.
Yeah, thank you. Let's dive right into that interesting and tough question. So how in your organizations does open source fit into your kind of company strategy? And I guess, how do you get leadership brought into that as something that's valuable? Guy, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So I think it's no secret, right? We announced our open sourcing of our kernel modules finally, and everyone joked that, hey, I started a month in and I got them to do that. Well, let's just disabuse that notion. That was in process for several years. But I think strategy-wise, right, like any technology company, we consume a lot of open source, right? And we build a lot of value on top of that open source, and we rely on that to build our products. And I think even more important than open source, well, as important as open source is how open standards fit into this. And so prior to coming to NVIDIA, and between my time at Autodesk and NVIDIA, I spent 2 years as executive director of Oasis Open, which is an open source and an open standards consortium. And so really that blend of, you know, what things need to be open source and what things should be open standards, so that you can have alternate implementations that may or may not be open source. That sort of whole strategy around how we deal with that is really important, because I think organizations, you know, want to feel like they have some control of their destiny and what they're building, but then there's always that sort of balance point of how do you work effectively with the community? How do you reuse things that are out there, right? Nobody wants to build the Linux kernel all over again. So kind of figuring out when you talk to executives, hey, there's a really good business strategy here. It's not about all this free stuff, right? There's no free lunch. We know that in open source, right? You can consume for so long. And when I was at Red Hat, we did a little bit of a consulting offering, and we had this thing, consume, contribute, and create, right, around a core of strategy and governance. And I think that's the way I like to look at open source. It's the way I like to talk to leaders that I work with, is understanding the business value and understanding the trade-offs, right? What things are you going to keep proprietary, and what things are going to make more sense to work with the open source community on.
In addition to what Guy has said, I've seen, because he has been talking about like building this infrastructure to start engaging in open source. And in that part, there is a lot of education. So an OSPO can be also seen as a way to educate the organization and all the teams into open source. Because when people have heard about open source, but they know that they need to start engaging with it because they are using it at some point, sometimes the way of thinking is like, okay, what should I give this, but what should I get in return? And open source, it's not that. It's like, I give back to the community and I'm not thinking about what I'm gonna to get in return. So this cultural change is something that a lot of OSPOs are also, the reason why so many OSPOs are also being formed, one of the other responsibilities is to create these ambassadors, internal ambassadors, to educate on the different layers of the organizations, from also the executive, but also developers, marketing team, HR. And I've also seen this kind of reason why creating an OSPO in many organizations so far.
And maybe a little addition. What I'm learning in my journey as well is that I think a lot of, if you look at strategy in OSPOs, is also concerned around, handling open source or managing open source. But I think it's also very valuable to people who are, product managers or need to think about adoption of products or technologies, and actually learning from open source how you can employ different business models, right? To sell your services or your products. And I think their open source also has a lot of things and inspiration. Apart from what you're saying, Anna, I believe how I also experience that is really trying to embrace an open source engineering mindset within your company, right? Maybe we're going to talk about inner sourcing, I presume, but those are very tangible benefits. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, just something that for us I think is quite important is in any big organization or medium big organization, there are people already interested on open source and probably contributing back, or even, but in different areas. I mean, you have people in engineering, of course, is the first people that came to mind. I mean, that, okay, engineering people are sure that they know about open source and using open source and probably contributing back. But there are also people from the legal department worried about, okay, what's this thing about licenses? What's happening here? What this license means to us? And the bigger the organization is, the more license, the more issues you might find. There are people from HR that will say, okay, we need to have a relationship with communities that we are contributing back, that we know we are using that product. And I think one of the main roles that the OSPO tries to be is this bridge between all these people, put them together. And okay, let's start from here in a very structured way, not anyone fighting their own battles, that we can go together and build a strategy to maximize the use, the usability, the sustainability of the projects that we are participating on. I think that's the key point for the OSPO.
Yeah, Felix, did you say something there about, did you mention inner source? Did I hear that come up?
Yes. Yeah, so I think, the typical engineers are exposed to open source, and a lot of them also contribute or in their spare time work on open source projects. But I think there are also a lot of engineers who are maybe a little bit new to this kind of things. And I do think that if you look at, open source is much more than software and licenses and all those kind of things. It's also a way of collaborating with people, and it provides a model which I think is in this day and age even more relevant, where all kinds of diverse people come around an idea in a project and figure out a way to collaborate and produce meaningful software, right? And without sometimes even having a formal organization like a company. And I think if you look at these patterns which emerge from those kind of things, there are a lot of patterns which are very valuable to incorporate in your own company, like contributing back to each other's teams, instead of having one team doing migration, have teams much more work in an integrated approach, and also make their code much more accessible internally inside a company, especially in large companies that could be silos, big projects. And I think I'm very interested in the guys' opinion about inner sourcing, especially in NVIDIA being such a large, diverse company. But I think to add to the OSPO discussion, I think, to me, an engineering culture or scaling an engineering culture largely revolves around patterns of inner sourcing inside your company, apart from other topics, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think inner sourcing is always an interesting challenge, right? And I've been at several places where it's worked really well, and several places where it hasn't. I think a lot of it has to do with where the company is culturally and sort of their maturity model, right? I mean, if you've got a company who's got a very monolithic architecture, maybe one or two products, sometimes it's hard to get the engineering teams to move to that inner source model. Not saying you shouldn't try, right? Not saying there's not value in doing that. Where it's worked well is in companies that tend to have much more agile and sort of free-form, architectures and loosely coupled architectures that it's easy to contribute, right? I mean, microservices is obviously the classic example, right? It's easier to contribute and have that inner source model when you don't have a monolithic architecture to kind of fight around, right? So I think part of that is based on sort of where that company is, culturally.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, that's one of the main topics in our OSPO nowadays that we call the OSPO, is that we are also managing inner source initiatives in the company, because we believe that it's the first step to go transparently outside is to start transparently inside, because it should be easier. I mean, you are under the same organization, you are already willing to collaborate. It's hope that everybody wants to collaborate with each other to make better products and stuff like that. So in our case, we are starting with inner source initiatives too, before releasing anything into open source. And that's also part of the early journey in an OSPO. It's okay, before doing something open, that everybody thinks like, okay, let's put this in GitHub in public and it's open source. Okay, why not starting internally to, okay, let's create a project that anyone in the organization can use, promote it, create a community inside, especially when your organization has like thousands of developers around. So there are communities much smaller than that, and you already have all in the same Teams account, so you can do it. You can announce whatever. So why not starting by there? So inner source makes a lot of sense here, I think.
And Anna, just changing tact ever so slightly. I think we kind of touched upon there throughout this conversation about getting it lined up with the company and all the initial stuff. So, in your opinion, what are some of the challenges of maintaining the open source program office within organizations?
Oh, so I would say that keeping educating is one of the main ones, because sometimes it's like, yeah, let's create an OSPO, or let's start adding investment into open source, but the project or the program doesn't go any farther because the people within the organization doesn't understand the real value. And I would say also to try to build this communication across non-tech teams that Manrique was mentioning, like, okay, I need to tell the legal team to work on processes and policies on open source compliance, start building the SBOM, software bill of materials, to let developers know which open source projects are good to go, which ones should we be not taking a look at it. So all that prior to starting taking actions needs a prior education of these people. And I've seen a lot of organizations that doesn't have an OSPO yet because they're still struggling into getting this value, into getting this education, and that is the main the main blocker I've seen in the early stage OSPOs.
Yeah, I would just add one real quick thing that I was thinking about this morning before we got on this call, which is that there's no, and somebody, I think, Anna, you may have said, there's no template, quote unquote, to build an OSPO, right? I mean, and I think I've seen OSPOs built when I was at Samsung from a top-down edict, really bought in engineering leadership, senior leadership that said, we need to create this because we've got a bunch of things that we rely on and we have no idea sort of how we manage this internally. And that's great, and that can work, and you can have centralized resources that, we hired engineers that were maintainers on projects that we cared about. And then I've seen it everywhere to kind of a more organic, which was a lot of what it was in my time at Autodesk, where it was, our media and entertainment team that was really, really deeply involved in open source and helped start the Academy Software Foundation, to, again, a place like NVIDIA, which is very, decentralized, and we have a lot of technologies, and sort of figuring out where you have traction and starting there and using an open source approach of, hey, let's start here and then we can grow it, right? And that's kind of been my approach now at NVIDIA, is working with a lot of other folks that I've come across that have said, hey, we actually believe we need an OSPO, but we kind of have to shape it this way. We kind of have to start with this piece. So I think it's really, really important to be flexible, right? I mean, if you've got senior executive leadership buy-in, awesome, go do that. If you need to kind of grow it more organically and then spread it out, that's a great way to do it as well.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges actually is if there is possibility that a company doesn't have an OSPO at all, it could happen because the company doesn't believe that needs that office at some point. Let's call it office. But there will be people managing, having tasks and initiatives that are related with OSPO work, daily work. Like if you don't deal with license issues, someone in legal should be worried at some point. So I'm sure that someone in legal is worried about, okay, which are all these dependencies we are relying on at some point. So probably it's not an OSPO, but it's a legal, only the legal part of the OSPO, or the human resources team, or the engineering team at some point. So I think the OSPO, it's a matter of the organization believes that, okay, do we need to manage this in a strategic way, or are we going to believe everybody's going to do by themselves, and let's see what happens. I think that's the main challenge, to see if an OSPO is running by themselves or not.
Sorry, I just wanted to add that to better understand what is an OSPO, see it as an open source best practice, as a way to, if you want to do like smart open source and accelerate this open source adoption and start doing open source and sustainability, see it as that, because you're putting a strategy on top of all the open source efforts your organization is already doing or should be taken care of. So you're having all this in a centralized place, and that it's much way easier than, oh, there is one team doing this legal thing and then the engineering team is on the other different context, and that is crazy.
Thank you. Just really quickly to wrap up, I think it'd be really good, and not to put you all on the spot here, but each of you, one piece of advice for anyone thinking about starting their own would be really helpful. Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I think it's maybe a cliche, but you know, I always like okay, let's go and think of grand plans, but really to make it very small and very tangible. And that sometimes means you maybe need to start with basically getting your license compliance in order. You know, that's something I'm working on right now, and it's not the subject which you know, inspires me the most, but it's really important to a company. So it's really to think big, but start small, because then you can also early on prove business value. And if you can prove business value, then if you come up with another thing you want to do, it paves the way in order to get people across. Basically what Guy was saying about, you know, organically starting it up, and whether you call it an OSPO or not, you know, that's something which comes later. I think that's the most important thing. So, but this depends also on your organization, of course, but that is something I learned, is go at it. And a last thing, sorry, there are two things, is I always say that I run the OSPO as an open source project itself, meaning that it can only be successful if all people inside the company also contribute back, so that it doesn't become, you know, like a service where you just ask and we do, but it's really, you know, the success of an OSPO relies on the people inside the company also contribute time and knowledge back to you in order to make it happen. If that doesn't, if that's not there, then it becomes very hard to set up an OSPO, I think.
Yeah, I would just echo that, Felix. And the way I always characterize it to folks is, there's a reason that the cliche in open source is true: release early, release often, right? It's a matter of picking that direction and then building on it, right? And I think you've hit on all the right points. It's figuring out, you know, where that kernel of traction or kernel of strategy is that you need in your organization, and then kind of building out from there. And I love what you said of running the OSPO as an open source project. I like to call it, you know, I think the most successful OSPOs I've seen have been more of the concierge style model, right? It's, hey, we'll help you figure out what you need to do. We're not going to do all of it for you.
I would say, I mean, taking another cliche, open source is already there. If you are a part of an organization, open source is already there. So if you care about the sustainability of your own organization, you should be taking care of the sustainability of the environment that surrounds your company. It's not only water, air, it's also code and open source code that is being used to build your business. So the business value of this is we want to be a successful company. So why not taking care of the open source ecosystem that surrounds us?
I would say that to learn something and to start figuring out, like, do you need an OSP? Do I need an OSP? Does my organization is ready for that? Take advantage of what is there already, because there are resources there are people that was in the same position as you in the past that can help, because we are open source, right? Like, we are engaging in open source, and there are a lot of open source communities that can help with the amazing community and also all the resources that are open to the public and can give you some inspiration and some guidance on how to start.
Cool, thank you everyone. It's been great talking to you all and hearing all your thoughts about this. Just want to say on behalf of Docker, it's really exciting to see how all these open source commitments across other companies, you know, it's something we're really passionate about at Docker ourselves. From everyone in the organization really loves to support the open source community, and thank you for giving your insights into it. I think it's really great to see. I just would like to mention to everyone watching this that we are relaunching our open source sponsored program to try and provide the tools to help people do all this great open source stuff. So please head to our website if that interests you. And we'll also be at the Open Source Summit in Europe, so please pop along and say hello. We'd love to talk to you about it. Cool. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for your time.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.